If you hate Stephen Miller, you are going to love this video because his deportation agenda and his illegal ICE raids are blowing up in his face and failing across the country. Not only did a massive data breach expose the personal information of ICE agents, but the propaganda apparatus Miller has been quietly constructing is now backfiring in public view. What we are seeing from Miller on camera is not confidence. It's panic, and that panic comes after the nationwide backlash to the horrific murder of Renee Nicole Good. But this isn't simply about protests in the streets or Democratic officials criticizing the administration. The pushback is coming from inside Donald Trump's own government, where senior officials have begun to revolt against a deportation regime that has become ungovernable, unaccountable, and soaked in systemic abuse. Within the administration, there is growing anger at the complete failure to address ICE's culture of brutality, secrecy, and power without oversight. ICE was built as an institutional weapon, and Miller intended it to function that way. But that design choice has consequences. It is collapsing under its own lawlessness. The question now is not whether ICE has overstepped, it is whether the institution can survive the scrutiny now pouring in from courts, states, activists, and even internal federal actors. Miller's ideological project, mass deportation paired with militarized domestic policing, is meeting reality for the first time, and reality is pushing back hard.
It was mass resignation day in the Trump Justice Department today from Minnesota to Washington, D.C. In Washington, 6 members of the Civil Rights Division of the Trump Justice Department quit. MS Now's Kara Lenig and Ken Delanian report, quote, top leaders of the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division have left their jobs to register their frustration with the department after the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Harmeet Dillon, decided not to investigate the ICE officer's fatal shooting of Renee Good last week. The criminal section of the division would normally investigate any fatal shooting by a law enforcement officer and specializes in probing potential or alleged abuse of improper use of force by law enforcement. So the most experienced lawyers in dealing with incidents like this at the Trump Justice Department are not being allowed to participate in the investigation in any way. And in Minnesota today, another 6 attorneys have quit the Trump Justice Department in the U.S. Attorney's Office there. The Minnesota Star Tribune reports that, quote, a majority of the leadership team at the Minnesota U.S. Attorney's Office resigned on January 13 over the direction of the Justice Department under the Trump administration. Among those who resigned was Joe Thompson, the lead federal prosecutor and public voice on uncovering rampant fraud in Minnesota. Joe Thompson is a 12-year veteran of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota and has been leading the fraud investigation in Minnesota that Donald Trump claims is the reason he sent thousands of federal agents to Minnesota in what our first guest tonight calls an invasion. The Minnesota Star Tribune reports, quote, the departures of several prosecutors stemmed from directives from top federal officials to staff members after the killing of Renee Good by ICE agent Jonathan Ross, according to sources familiar with the decision. That included blocking the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension from the investigation into the shooting and a request from the Justice Department to investigate Good's widow for possible federal charges. Governor Tim Walz, whose state government has been the focus of Joe Thompson's fraud investigation, said, quote, Joe is a principled public servant who spent more than a decade achieving justice for Minnesotans. This is a huge loss for our state.
I think the Trump administration at this point understands they can't do cover-ups. It's not going to work. People will always speak out. People will always stand up. And that's exactly what we are seeing right now. Not just with the leaks of personal information of ICE agents, which many believe is a consequence of the agency acting without accountability, but also with the reaction to the propaganda that Stephen Miller has been trying to quietly push. Miller publicly announced that agencies should not be doxxed, that agents should not have their identities exposed, and that they should be allowed to operate in communities with impunity. Yet what is happening now directly contradicts that claim. We are seeing people refuse to let ICE hide behind masks and anonymity while they conduct raids. They are calling for accountability in both the courts and in the court of public opinion. ICE agents are being exposed, not protected, because communities believe it's vital to know who is entering and harassing neighborhoods. The opposite of the narrative Miller tried to force while collapsing under scrutiny on national television.
So the public is behind this. Minnesota was once a pristine state, perfect education, no crime, no unrest, no violence, and then they ruined all of it, Laura, and President Trump is saving it.
Donald Trump claims he is saving Minnesota from crime. But the reality on the ground tells a different story. If there is crime happening in Minnesota right now, it is being carried out by ICE agents. Who murdered a woman in cold blood? It wasn't the community. It was an ICE officer. This is the upside-down narrative coming out of this administration, a narrative built on propaganda, fear, and a fascistic rebirth slogan that echoes the ugliest chapters of the 20th century. According to this messaging, Minnesota must be reborn. It must be corrected. It must be made great again. None of this is accidental. It is a deliberate strategy from the administration, documented in reporting that has triggered Stephen Miller's very public meltdown. One article puts it plainly: the Trump administration has been accused of adopting Hitler-era propaganda. The messaging has escalated in the wake of last week's ICE shooting, as the White House pushes out social media content, recruitment videos, and staged photography featuring cabinet officials framed with extremist visual cues and authoritarian overtones, some lifted straight from 1930s propaganda playbooks. This is not subtle. They are intentionally signaling. They know exactly who receives the message, and they celebrate that feedback loop. The notable thing is what is not happening in Minneapolis. When brave community members protest ICE and demand accountability, there are no MAGA counter-protests. Normally, that is exactly what would occur. Anywhere progressives gather, there is usually a reactionary attempt to intimidate or provoke. So why isn't it happening here? The answer, many locals argue, is that those individuals are already inside ICE. Former Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Jane Darch 6 pardonees, extremists who once operated on the fringe, now have badges, federal paychecks, and authorization to police communities. Trump's version of public safety is not about safety at all. It is about remaking America for the most aggressive and ideologically extreme elements of his movement and calling it a revival. He is granting people who once operated on the margins of legality an opportunity to re-enter public life, but only under a mask and without genuine accountability. The most ruthless traits of his politics, the resentments, the conspiratorial thinking, the grievance, the obsession with domination, have been stitched together like a political Frankenstein's monster and unleashed through ICE. And that is why communities cannot simply ignore this. It is not just policy, it is transformation. It is the Trump administration placing its darkest instincts into the hands of armed federal personnel and expecting no one to push back.
To all ICE officers, you have federal immunity in the conduct of your duties. And anybody who lays a hand on you...
No, they do not have absolute immunity. And it's time for Democrats to stop acting as if ICE should be untouchable. There are still Democrats saying, well, I don't know if we should defund ICE, or I don't know if we should get tough with the budget. It's one thing to worry about slogans during a midterm election, but that isn't a serious argument for protecting an institution that has openly abused its power. This isn't the same debate as defund the police, though even there many Americans are now asking whether policing in this country, an institution born out of slave patrols and racial control, needs a fundamental structural overhaul. You can have different opinions on that, but ICE is a separate case entirely. ICE, as it currently exists, should be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. Of course, there should be customs and border enforcement. No one is arguing that the United States shouldn't have customs, but the version of ICE we have now is not customs. It's a paramilitary domestic force operating with secrecy, impunity, and political motivation. And who exactly feels sentimental loyalty toward ICE? Does the average American see ICE as an institution that keeps them safe? Of course not. What they see right now are images of unmasked aggression, brutality, intimidation, and political showmanship. From a political standpoint, the idea that criticizing ICE is a liability is outdated. At this moment, it's more politically salient than ever to demand accountability from the agency or restructure it entirely. So when Democrats say they want to protect the ICE budget, that raises real questions. And when Democrats actively praise ICE, it becomes even harder to justify. There is no political upside to defending something most Americans view as abusive, lawless, or unnecessary. For example, in Minnesota, Senate candidate Angie Craig voted to express gratitude to ICE. And there is no reason voters should reward that position when alternatives exist in the primary. All of this is happening at the same time Stephen Miller is melting down publicly as a massive leak reportedly exposes personal information of thousands of Border Patrol and ICE personnel. It's not surprising that Miller immediately rushed to reassure ICE that they will be protected, that they can do whatever they want, and that they have absolute immunity. That statement wasn't about confidence. It was about fear. Fear that ICE agents might hesitate for even a moment before acting, fear that accountability might finally enter the equation, and fear that Miller's ideological army might lose its sense of impunity. Miller needs ICE to believe they are above scrutiny. He needs them to feel untouchable. Without that, his broader deportation and intimidation project falls apart. That's why he panicked. That's why he scrambled to defend them. And that's why even Fox News hosts, including Laura Ingraham, pushed back on him. He has become that unpopular, that toxic, and that isolated. Yeah, it really is a strange badge of honor for Stephen Miller to think that being universally disliked somehow makes him tough. As if the problem is that liberals don't like him, when in reality almost no one likes him. His persona is so deeply off-putting that even people in his own orbit distance themselves, and his entire political brand depends on resentment rather than persuasion. But Miller's latest meltdown wasn't the only humiliation on Fox News this week. Representative Maxwell Frost went on air with one of Fox's least serious hosts, Will Cain, and completely dismantled his talking points. It was an absolute palate cleanser after so much Stephen Miller content. Frost made 2 points that cut straight through the administration's messaging. First, Renee Nicole Good was denied due process. The ICE agent became judge, jury, and executioner in that moment. Second, and equally important, within minutes of the shooting, the first people to label anyone involved were members of the Trump administration itself, including Kristi Noem and Stephen Miller, who pushed the narrative that Good was a domestic terrorist before any facts were known. That's the propaganda strategy. Label first, investigate later, and rely on fear to fill in the gaps. Frost didn't let that slide, and it was refreshing to see Democrats go into hostile territory and shut down that kind of framing instead of avoiding it. More should do the same. Fox News tries to present itself as the arena where Democrats get flustered, but in segments like this, it becomes obvious how hollow the platform's arguments are. When confronted with actual information and moral clarity, they fold. Frost exposed that dynamic in real time, calling out Miller, Noem, and the administration for smearing a dead woman and justifying lethal state violence isn't partisan theater, it's accountability. And that accountability needs to continue because the Trump administration's strategy relies on no one pushing back.
Or tries to stop you or tries to obstruct you is committing a felony. You have immunity to perform your duties, and no one, no city official, no state official, no illegal alien, no leftist agitator or domestic insurrectionist can prevent you from fulfilling your legal obligations and duties. And the Department of Justice has made clear that if officials cross that line into obstruction, into criminal conspiracy against the United States or against ICE officers.
By the way, the only person less popular than yours truly at these insurgent rallies is you. Okay, so my favorite sign from last Thursday was Stephen Miller.
None of us are eager to get the support of domestic terrorists. What we want is the support of the patriotic American people who built and sustained this country. They stand with President Trump. They stand with ICE and Border Patrol. They stand with America and the American flag.
Stephen, it's great to see you, my